Welcome to the Parenting Then and Now podcast, the show that remembers the good and sometimes the not so good old days of parenting past. I'm your host, Samantha Kemp-Jackson from the Multiple Mayhem Mama blog, and every week we'll be talking about how things were then and how they are now, parenting through the lens of the ages, if you will. Now, whether you're a parent, a kid, or someone who used to be a kid, you'll want to stay tuned as we reminisce about the past, embrace the future, and marvel in the present how things have changed. If you're ready to glance back in time at kids, parenting, and the good old days, you're in the right place. So sit back, relax, and let's take a trip down parenting's memory lane. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Many of us grew up in a household where the adherence to the family religion was standard. Regardless of one's religious denomination, the importance of a faith-based family life was taught to many children from an early age. Fast forward to today, where religion on the whole has taken a backseat to more secular pursuits and interests. On this episode of the podcast, we're going to tackle religion, faith, and one woman's journey to her very strong belief system that she came to as a young adult. Fariha Naqvi's parents raised her in a secular household, but when she became friends with a committed, interesting, and inspiring group of Muslim women, Fariha realized that the faith of her parents was one that she wanted to revisit, and boy, did she revisit it, and more. Fariha is a writer, a journalist, and a woman of color living in Montreal, raising children of her own. Her parenting then and now retrospection in this episode as it relates to both her faith and her perspective from her unique vantage point is both evocative and inspiring. Here's our interview. Welcome to the Parenting Then and Now podcast, Fariha. Thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
And Fariha, I really wanted to talk to you because I think that you have such an interesting life and an interesting story. And I am curious about some of your perspectives on parenting, both as an adult now with young children and you growing up. So I know that you live in Montreal. You've lived there your whole life. Can you give us a little bit of a background in terms of how you grew up and your typical kind of family life?
Well, I was born and raised in Montreal. With the exception of 5 years where I lived in Toronto, I've been in Montreal the rest of my life. And I grew up in a very secular Indo-Pak family. And I grew up where religion wasn't really at the forefront. It was more just kind of there from a cultural standpoint. And my parents immigrated to Montreal in the 1970s from Germany, where my dad lived and grew up. So there was very much of an emphasis on just kind of more assimilating into society. And so I grew up in a very middle upper class white neighborhood. There was a lack of cultural diversity. Back when I was in elementary school and into high school, I was actually considered the black girl.
Oh,
in
really?
my high school, because there was nobody else who was remotely had any sort of pigmentation, let's say. So I was literally considered a black girl.
Okay, and just to step back for a minute, for our listeners, what is your ethnic background?
So my parents' mom was born in India and my father was born in Pakistan.
So Fariha, you had mentioned the secular nature of your childhood growing up in Montreal, and the fact that you focused on that I found really interesting. And I'm curious as to why the secular nature of your childhood and your current faith and your religion is important to you now. Can you expand a little bit more on that?
Absolutely. Growing up in a very secular home, religion was kind of like a background noise. It wasn't prominent in how we were raised. And as such, my siblings and I kind of practiced our religion in very different ways. And as in my adult life and my profession and what I do, much of it centers around my identity as a Quebec-born, visible Muslim woman, and how that has shaped my outlook and I guess my life.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the secular nature of your childhood, you said it was more like a backdrop to growing up. So it wasn't, I guess it wasn't a focus in your family. Were your parents very religious, or I guess not?
My parents were not very religious, actually. They came, when they immigrated to Montreal in the 1970s, it was with the intention of a better life and better future for their family, but it was also to leave some of that religious dogma behind in India and Pakistan.
Mm-hmm. So this is really interesting to me. So you had a secular childhood, and then there obviously was a time where you got to the point and you thought, you know what, my faith or my parents' faith, even if it was not very strong, is really important to me. How and when did that happen?
That happened for me in the first semester of CEGEP, which is the equivalent of, let's say, grade 12 outside of Quebec. And I met some practicing Muslim women, and I realized at that point that I knew a lot of people who were born Muslim, but not necessarily practicing, and women who covered their hair and who dressed modestly. And for me, it was very intriguing. It coincided with the time of life, a lot of teenagers are kind of trying to find yourself and your identity. And I found it strangely intriguing and empowering to see these really intelligent women who chose what they showed the world of themselves. You know, they covered their bodies and their hair, and it reinforced this idea that I always had kind of ruminating inside of me, which was that a woman should be judged for her intellect and not for just the way she looks.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Now, I think that there are so many things there that we can unpack in terms of you coming to your faith, you embracing your faith, you surrounding yourself with these intelligent women who were strong women as well of faith. That must have been a real big change, not only for yourself to transition into somebody who was focusing on that as part of their life, to your family and to your friends. How did that transition go, and what was the reaction from your family?
Interestingly enough, contrary to what a lot of people like to tell me online, that I must be being forced into wearing the hijab and dressing the way that I do by my family, it was actually very much the opposite. My parents were actually really worried, and when I put on the hijab, they kind of freaked out. They didn't want me wearing it. They saw it as me going backwards into a life that they had kind of left behind, and they were concerned about my safety and security and what will other people think, and will it make me a target? And they didn't want me wearing it. And in fact, in many ways, I had to fight against my family in order to wear the hijab.
Wow. Now, let me ask you this. Do you have brothers or sisters? And if you do have brothers or sisters, were they of similar minds as your parents in terms of being more secular and being concerned for you?
They were, actually. So my brother has always kind of been my number one cheerleader, I guess, supporter. And so I always had his support, thankfully. My sister, however, while we both physically look quite a bit alike, we're very different in terms of who we are and how we were growing up. My sister doesn't really practice the faith at all. She's raising her children without religion. That's kind of the decision that her and her husband are making. And she sees herself as a Pakistani person, but not necessarily as a Muslim person.
I'm sure that people have, misconceptions about your faith and your religion and the fact that you have chosen to wear a hijab. And I think a lot of people don't understand it. So for those who maybe have questions or don't understand what it means, could you maybe give us some information so that we can go away and understand, what it means to your faith and why you wear it?
Absolutely. I mean, I spoke earlier about how me personally, hijab is a form of empowering. I feel empowered by wearing the hijab and by choosing what I show the world. However, it goes beyond that. In terms of my faith, men and women are both encouraged to be modest in, practicing Muslim men and women. And so for men, a lot of, you'll see men with beards as a form of modesty who might be dressed in a slightly looser clothing than the norm. And for women, the same thing applies, is to cover ourselves and to be modest in how we dress. And it varies from person to person. And so for me, faith is a very personal thing. And it's a personal decision, and how I choose to practice my faith is by covering my body, with the exception of my face and my hands and my feet. I wear, I cover my body, I cover my hair, and I choose what it is that I want to show the world. And for me, that there is something that is so powerful in forcing the other person to really focus on your intellect and who you are, and not just on the way that you look.
Mm-hmm. And what I really like about what you said before was that you are talking to your children about your faith, but you said that your daughter can choose what she wants to do. And I think that's really important that people know that, because I think there's a misconception with some folks who think that it's not a choice. And you have very clearly said that this was a choice that you made as a young adult.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that with anyone, with any person, I feel very strongly that no person should be told how they can and how they cannot dress. And similarly, people should not be told how they should or should not dress. And so it is so profound. I mean, there's people, I mean, right here in the political landscape here in Quebec, a lot of the hateful rhetoric that I've been hearing is people telling me to go back to where I'm from. And I laugh because it's being said to me here in Quebec. And I ask them if that should be like the downtown Montreal or what specific neighborhood they're referring to. And people tell me that, well, that's not how it is when, my country, and they tell me about whatever country they're from and, the awful atrocities that they face. And I tell them that, with all due respect, I can't speak to where they're from, but I can tell them a little bit about my country. And in my country, we respect one another. And in my country, we have freedom of expression and freedom to practice our faith in whatever way we deem best. And of course, I'm speaking about Canada. So it kind of, they kind of huff and puff and they walk off, or they kind of will just exit the conversation really quickly shortly thereafter.
Of course they will. Of course. Hit them with facts. So let me ask you one more question, because I think that there is a misconception with some people, not all, but some people, about women's role within your faith, in the Muslim faith. And I think it's important that coming from somebody who obviously you're very well versed in your faith and you practice it regularly. Can you talk about that position of women, because you are raising a daughter, and if she does choose to follow your footsteps into the faith, you will have to tell her whatever that perspective is. So can you talk a little bit about that, about women in the faith? Because I think there's a lot of misconception there.
That's an excellent question, because there's a lot of cultural dogma there. There's a lot of people who take certain cultural traditions and impose them and insinuate that that's what the religion of Islam preaches. And there's a lot of misconception there. So Islam protects and honors women in incredible ways in terms of the ability to vote. Women have been voting in Islam for the last 1,400 years versus what we see in Western culture, where it's been a few hundred years. Women have been given the right to own land and property, again, for over 1,400 years. The rights and the responsibilities that a husband has towards his wife, and not vice versa. A lot of the rhetoric we hear about faith is that women have to serve their man, and women have to be lesser than their husbands. But the religion of Islam, and what really speaks to my heart, is that men have to provide for women. I mean, if my husband works and he's responsible for taking care of my family, and if I work, that money's mine. In the religion of Islam, it's very empowering that a husband is responsible for providing for the family, and there's no pressure or onus on a woman to provide for the family. I mean, if she so chooses, she can, but women are protected and the rights of women are protected.
I have to jump in because, like I'm going to play devil's advocate, and there are going to be some people who are going to say, well, I don't know if that's a good idea. So you're saying that, men have to provide and women just, get to, my money is mine. Some people are going to have a problem with that, right?
Well,
so what do you say?
I'll say what I always say, which is that I tell my husband, I said, what's yours is mine and what's mine is mine. And so I've had people, I have had people tell me, I've had, politicians and friends of mine who work in, high levels of government, laugh and say, Fariha, you are so the opposite of what people assume that a Muslim woman is quiet and, docile. And so, and it's the exact opposite. But it's because of how empowered I feel as a Muslim woman and the rights and responsibilities and the position of authority that is held within a Muslim family for the woman. The rights as a mother are 3 times greater than the rights of a father. And these are all beautiful aspects of my faith that empower me and make me so proud to be a Canadian-born Muslim woman.
I think for listeners out there who don't have some of the background in terms of Canada and specifically Quebec, there have been, unfortunately, quite a number of issues with cultural racism, for lack of a better term, racism against people who practice the Muslim faith. So I think that you're wearing a hijab could probably be seen by some people as making a statement. And if I'm correct in what you mentioned, it sounds like your parents and your family were thinking that you were making a statement and that was putting you at risk. Can you expand a little bit more on the cultural kind of landscape of what has been happening in Quebec and how you've navigated that? And then we can kind of get to what you're doing now, because I think that's really interesting as well.
I think what's really important is to understand that back when I wore the hijab, I think back to it now, and I think back to the early days and how difficult it was. I went through periods of time where I wouldn't be speaking with certain family members in my immediate family. I went through periods of time where I would literally go to the mall with a family member who would drop me at the door and say, okay, I'll see you in a couple of hours. And I remember turning to this person and saying, well, I thought we were going shopping together. And this was shortly after I started wearing the hijab, and only to learn and realize that they didn't actually want to be seen with me. And this was a close family member. And those sort of experiences really shaped my resolve. And I think looking back on it, I mean, everything is kind of, the perspective I have is it's all a blessing in disguise, because it forced me to question my resolve to the extent that I had to decide, is this worth it? I mean, my own family was against me. Is this something I really want to do? And now I can actually go back and thank my family, who have come a long way, but I can actually go back and thank them for those experiences, because without those experiences, I don't know, it might have been a phase. I can't really say. But it really solidified for me just my resolve and why it is that I want to wear the hijab and what it represents to me. And like I said, I mean, all of those experiences really shaped me into the woman that I am today.
This is so interesting. So just for our listeners as well, let's just clarify. So I think you grew up, was it in the 1990s when you were a child? When were you a child?
It was in pretty much the 1990s.
1990s. And do you think that Quebec has come a long way more positively or negatively in terms of their perceptions of people who don't practice the, faith that, a lot of the citizens there do?
Well, I can tell you that if you had asked me this question 3 weeks ago, my answer might have been different. Right now, Quebec is going through a lot of political turmoil when it comes to its religious minorities. And I, along with many others, are at the forefront of that battle, particularly when it comes to religious symbols, which is how the hijab is deemed to be in Quebec. It's not a term that I would necessarily agree with.
Yes, and just please, for the listeners, please clarify, because I know what you're talking about. For people who don't understand what you're referring to, can you just explain the whole quote-unquote religious symbol argument that some people in Quebec are making?
Well, the new leader of the that just got voted in actually October 1st, François Legault, has essentially said that for religious minorities who wear religious symbols, they cannot work in the public sector. So initially it was said that they cannot be teachers or judges or lawyers or work in any sort of service for the public. And it's been absolutely mind-boggling. It's been, I mean, I can spend probably 2 days talking to you about just the impact it's had on all Quebecers, but especially the religious minorities, to really just overnight to go from, successful professionals contributing to society to second-class citizens that are under a magnifying glass and having terrible, awful things hurled, insults, just derogatory comments made to us online, in person. It's just been horrible.
So what you're saying then is, so if you're wearing, are you not allowed to wear a hijab if you're in these roles now? Is that what you're saying? Because I don't know how that's legal.
So that's essentially what was initially proposed, and François Legault took a page out of Doug Ford's book and used the notwithstanding clause to bypass any of that sort of legal rhetoric or, the charter, Canadian rights and freedoms, our Charter of Rights. And he just, honestly, it's been a lot to wrap our head around. And just, I feel like the entire focus, everything, it's just, I'm still wrapping my head around how in 2018 this could be happening. There was a massive rally last weekend where thousands of people attended, and people are protesting in the streets against this. And since then, François Legault has said, well, because of some of the public outcry, it's not going to affect the people who are currently in those fields, in those professions, but it would apply to people who want to go into those professions. So, for example, I have an almost 13-year-old daughter. She knows that the choice to wear the hijab is hers to make and hers alone. But I have to think as a parent that should my daughter decide to wear the hijab, and should she decide to become a teacher or a lawyer or a judge, that she would not be permitted to do so under this piece of legislation. It goes against my instinct as a mother, which is to, encourage my children to pursue their dreams and tell them that the sky's the limit, and if they work hard, they can achieve anything. Unfortunately, here in Quebec, if you work hard, you can achieve anything so long as you don't wear a hijab, a kippah, or a turban.
I'm actually speechless. I didn't realize that it was to this degree, and let me just take this back a little bit. So you've made a very valid point about your daughter. So tell me how many kids you have and how old they are, and how are you talking to them about your faith and religion? I know that you said that it's her choice to make in terms of, what direction she goes in wearing a hijab and such. But in light of the current landscape and in light of the things that you just brought up and the concerns that you would have as a mother, which I totally understand, what are you saying to her? And what do you think the direction is that she's going to go and the decisions that she's going to make? How is that going to be affected by the landscape?
Well, to start, I've got two children. So my daughter is going to be 13 at the end of the month, and my son is 10 years old. And contrary to how old they were a few years ago when we had the Charter of Values debate here in Quebec, which is a similar piece of legislation without the teeth, of course, the notwithstanding clause. It was proposed by a government that shortly after got voted out, largely attributed to this, where people just came out and they voted against it, and we thought that was behind us. So my children were much younger then, and so I wouldn't really speak to them as openly about this subject. I mean, they were aware largely because of the work that I do as a journalist. However, now they're at the stage right now where they're learning about these things in school, especially my daughter. She's in grade 8. So she's learning about the charter. She's learning about what's legal. She's learning about the different branches of government and the role that the government's supposed to have. So it creates these conversations that at home around the dinner table that both make me incredibly proud, but also incredibly disgusted. That as a parent, I have to be talking to my child, not just about something that's going on, but something that's going on right now that has the potential to directly impact her future.
Mm-hmm. And, because this podcast is really about parenting and the comparative nature of parenting, then and now, whether it's from the perspective of a child or as from the perspective of a parent, how would you say that the discussions that you're having with your daughter, and I'm sure your son, are different in terms of the depth and the scope of the content to when you were growing up? And do you think that it's a positive thing in terms of the scope and depth that you're having now with these conversations compared to when you were a child, or a negative thing, and why? Or why not?
I would say that growing up to the parent of, as a child, the Canadian-born child of immigrant parents, the realities and the conversations we dealt with were very different. My parents, God bless them, were always about, just talking to us about pursuing our education and higher education and working and, strategizing and how to assimilate into society and become contributing members of society. And I use the word assimilate instead of integrate, and that relates back to what I said earlier about having a secular upbringing. And those conversations were profound in a different way, but they lacked that sort of depth and critical thinking that I would have perhaps liked. I mean, I owe everything to my parents and for making the decision to start a new life in a new country. But if I compare that to how my husband and I are raising our children and the conversations that we have, where everything's up for discussion. We talk to the children about what's going on, we try to make them self-aware for our children. Unfortunately, as a practicing Muslim family, we have to bring our kids, we have to bring it to our kids' attention that not everybody out there will be kind. Not everybody out there, you have to be careful. I mean, these are really awful realities, but they're realities nonetheless, and having to tell the kids that, well, we have to be able to physically protect yourself, how to react if somebody is being verbally or physically abusive. We have to teach the kids. I mean, I'm so afraid of my daughter being on social media or even going onto social media because of so much of the hateful rhetoric that's out there right now. And but it's a reality. I have an almost 13-year-old who will be kind of going on more social media platforms, and I have to prepare her for what she might see.
Yeah. Wow. There's so much to kind of take in and think about in terms of your perspective and the issues that you need to bring to the fore with your children because of the cultural landscape in which you're living and because of the times in which we're living. I think at this point, we're just going to take a quick break for a word from our sponsor, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the things that you're doing to make a difference within your community. So let's just take a quick break and then we'll come right back. So welcome back to the Parenting Then and Now podcast. We're speaking with Fariha. And Fariha, you were just before the break talking about some very important points regarding the nature of what's happening in Quebec society regarding, your sense of safety and the adherence to your culture and talking to your kids and that type of thing. I know that you are doing some really important work within the community from a journalistic point of view. And that was part of why I wanted to have you on the show, because you're a great journalist, and I know that you write for the Montreal Gazette, and you are on City in Montreal, and you've got a specific segment about diversity. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I am so proud to be part of the City TV team for the newly launched City News Montreal newscast, 6 p.m. and 11 p.m. that just launched on September 3rd. And I'm
Congrats.
actually making, thank you. It's fantastic. It's an absolute dream come true. And I'm also making history here in Quebec as being the first woman to wear a hijab on Quebec television.
Way to go, girl. Way to go.
Thank you.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And I will post links and photos of you and some of your columns and some of your segments on the show notes page for this podcast. So everybody who's listening, please check it out. Go on, Fariha.
Thank you. So I think I'm very passionate about the work that I do. And if you look back, taking a few steps back when I made the decision to wear the hijab, as we were speaking about earlier, I always knew since I was about 7 years old that I wanted to be a journalist. It was a passion of mine. It was a dream of mine. And when I made that decision, and later on, about 10 years later, when I put on the hijab, I realized very quickly that the fact that I decided to wear the hijab might mean walking away from that dream of mine of being a journalist, because there was nobody who looked like me out there in the mainstream media. And so I acknowledged that, and I came to terms with it, and I carried on with my life. And when I launched my blog, Canadian Mommy, I did so initially as just, as a hobby. Didn't really know what I was getting into. But I've always been a passionate ambassador of cultural diversity. It's been very organic for me, just as who I am as a person. And when I started to write about the Charter of Values debate that took place in 2012, 2013, here in Quebec, my initial post, which is an open letter to the then Premier, Pauline Marois, that post went absolutely viral. And it kind of thrust my blog into a completely different direction, where I went from not talking about politics or religion, because those are taboo subjects that nobody's supposed to talk about. I realized in talking about that stuff that it was resonating with thousands of people here in Canada and millions of people around the world. And I thought, okay, well, I might be onto something here. And I started writing a little bit more about my identity as a Quebec-born Canadian Muslim woman. And, it brought a lot of people, a lot of things into question, made people really kind of ask a lot of questions. And, people were surprised and told me that they were astonished to hear that a Muslim woman could be articulate. What? And you would be astonished if you. No, if
I
you
actually would, but I wouldn't. Yeah.
Yeah. So it just went into that whole. It just anyhow. So fast forward a little bit more, and I was very passionate about my blog. I still am. It's my third baby, and I was, one day I got a call from the Montreal Gazette saying, "Hey, Fariha, we've been reading your blog for a couple of years, and we love your writing, and would you be interested in a column?"
That is so awesome.
So, of course, I thought, this must be a crank call. But no, I was very humbled, and I said, yes, of course. And then I shared with them shortly after that it was literally a dream come true to be writing for the Montreal Gazette. And be afforded that space. Right now at this point, I have my own column every Friday in the Montreal Gazette. In the op-ed section, I have my own op-ed column. It's a space for me to really write with carte blanche, really write about my views and on Quebec politics, life here in Montreal, and just from my unique perspective as, like I said, a Quebec-born Canadian Muslim woman. And so that column's been going fantastic. The response has been incredible. And then a few months ago, I got another phone call from City News Montreal saying that, it was from City TV, saying that they are launching a newscast in Montreal on September 3rd, and they're looking for a video journalist, and is that something that I might be interested in? And I had to pinch myself I felt it was a dream come true. And so, of course, I said, yeah, sure. I'm definitely interested in it. And again, it just became a platform for just being true to myself. growing up, as I mentioned, in a non-culturally diverse community and really standing out like a sore thumb, my identity was something that I used to be ashamed of for much of my youth. I felt like I just had to keep trying harder. And I realized that no matter how hard I tried, I would never be white.
Mm-hmm.
And,
no, you never would be. And
I would,
why?
yeah.
Why would, and again, the fact that you would say that, and I understand because I'm a person of color, the fact that you would say that and that it would even be a consideration is something that all of us, regardless of what our skin color is or our background, need to think about. And I also want to say that, first of all, kudos to you for where you've gotten in your life and career, because it's all because you had the resolve to be who you were and to stick to your principles and your values. And I think that's a really important lesson for all of us, kids, adults, whomever. But the second thing I want to say that you perfectly elucidate is the fact that representation matters. It is so important that we see different, diverse faces on the screens, in the newspapers, online, on social media, and that young children who are coming up, irrespective of whether or not they're wearing a hijab or whether or not they're Black, white, South Asian, Chinese, it doesn't matter. They need to see themselves represented. And I think that what you've done with sticking to your guns and having that resolve that you talked about a little bit earlier, in knowing that this is the direction you wanted to go in, and that you are a strong supporter of your faith and you feel strongly about it, and that you're not going to waver in your resolve. I think this is an amazing lesson for all of us, and specifically for kids coming up, that you can be anything you want to be, and you can stick to your guns and your values, and you will get what you deserve. So kudos to you for where you've gotten, and I'm glad that you're out there kind of spreading the word.
Thank you so much. And I think one of the biggest lessons, or one of the biggest realizations that I came to right away, is when I was on Breakfast Television in Montreal and we made the announcement that I've joined the City TV team. And I finished up that segment, and I just left. I'd left the stage, and I was walking over to the makeup room, and one of the interns was there, and she's from an Asian background, and she grabbed my arm and she said, "Did I just hear that you got hired by this network?" And I said, "Yes, I did." She said, "Are you a journalist?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Oh my gosh." And she just froze, and she said, "I'm studying journalism right now, and there's nobody else in my entire program that looks like me." And I was actually considering changing my major because I was tired of standing out, and I didn't think I could go anywhere. So she said, "Thank you." And then a short while later, I was actually just a couple of days later, I was on the train, and it all happened with, it was these incidents have been happening quite a lot in the last few weeks. And I had, I was sitting next to a young girl, I would say girl, but she's probably late teens, early 20s, and a Black girl. And she was on her phone, and she was actually on, she was watching Breakfast Television. She was watching the episode that I was on. So she was on her phone. And so she's looking down, and she's got her headset on, and she looks over at me, and she looks at the screen, and she goes, "Is that you?" And I said, "Yeah, that is me." And she looked at me and she said, "Are you a journalist?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she goes, "And you're going to be on TV?" Or she goes, "You are on TV?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Whoa, I didn't think that people who looked like us could do that."
Wow. That must have made you feel so great.
Honestly, it's just been surreal, because the number of times that I am stopped on the street or downtown or on the train, and I've had people come over and just kind of tap me and just say, "Thank you," and just walk off. And it's just been, it's not even about me. I just feel like I say this all the time, that it's about the little girl who looks different, or the little boy who looks different. And what it's about is really just giving them permission to dream.
Yes, absolutely. And that representation, we need to see ourselves represented in the larger media. We haven't as much as we are now, and we still have a ways to go. And you're definitely leading the charge. So let me ask you this about your Montreal Gazette column and also your City TV videography. Are you going to be addressing specific issues, maybe more with the videography relating to children, parenting, your faith, and how those are all going to go together? Because I think that for those people who, are the naysayers or saying the negative things to you online, or, the rhetoric that you refer to, they really need an education. And I think you've got a great platform to provide that for them. So are you going to be going down that road in terms of family and parenting related stuff, or are you doing more kind of news stories?
So that's a really great question. And so with respect to the Montreal Gazette, I have, as I mentioned, I'm blessed to have a lot of free reign in terms of what I talk about. And I touch upon my identity as a mom, as a person of color, as a Muslim woman, as a Quebecer. I talk about all of these identities. They kind of touch upon them in many of my columns, if not, I would say, every one of them. Just that unique perspective that it gives me. With respect to City TV, I made the decision, and it was working with the team, to not be a news journalist, because in being a news journalist, I would need to be completely non-objective. Sorry, I would have to be completely. If I were a news journalist, I would need to be completely objective, and that's something that my position with my blog, as well as my column with the Montreal Gazette, it would go against the work that I do, and it would kind of force me to not speak so passionately, to not vocalize the issues that really matter to me and not speak about those. So I worked with the folks at City TV, and we actually created, I have my own segment, which is actually called Diverse City. And it's the only segment of its kind in Canada to be talking about. I'm going into different cultural communities, and I'm talking about with the people from those communities and talking about the issues that matter to those people and bringing those stories to the general public.
That's amazing. That's fantastic. You're definitely a leader in this field if it's the only one in Canada. So where do you see it going? What types of stories have resonated thus far with your segment? And do you feel like you're going to expand it a little bit further into other areas?
I really feel that at this point, the sky is the limit in terms of what we can explore. I want to make sure we have equal access to every single one of the cultural and religious communities here in Montreal. And we've already started going into the various cultural groups. I'm working on a segment in the Italian community right now. And I'm learning very quickly that a lot of the immigrant experience that so many of us have, there's so many similarities in terms of some of the struggles and the issues faced by these cultural groups, and how these communities have come together to support their own, but also to give back to the greater community.
Right. So there are many stories to be told, and I'm so glad and heartened to hear that there's someone like yourself telling those stories. So Fariha, so one thing I always ask my guests, and before we kind of wrap up, do you feel, I know that's a little bit more complicated because we've talked about some very sensitive topics, but do you feel that it was easier, and I don't know if you can answer this, was it easier being a kid or an adult parent when you were growing up in the 90s, or now? Do you feel that it's more complicated now? Do you feel that because we've come a little bit further in terms of our understanding generally as a society, in some ways it gives you a little bit more ability to raise your kid? Like, what are you thinking in terms of comparing your childhood and how you grew up to how you are raising your kids? What's similar? What's different? What works? What doesn't work?
That's an excellent question. And I would have to say that as a child, I was very sheltered. I wasn't aware of what's going on politically necessarily. We weren't as civically engaged as I guess my family would be now. So it was very much about, sunshine and lollipops and playing at the park. And I'm very thankful and very, very blessed to have had that sort of beautiful childhood that I know that not everyone is fortunate enough to have. Certainly now as a parent, it's really important to me to have my children be self-aware and be civically engaged and to know what the issues are and to realize what's happening in the world and how it affects them and where they are and the role that they have to play in society. And also making my children realize how fortunate they are, how fortunate we all are to be able to express ourselves, to be living in a country where we have those rights and freedoms. I mean, I took a deep breath there because I realized, of course, I'm living through, the Quebec political sphere right now. But, we have those freedoms to express ourselves and to engage in political debate and to share our views and how blessed we are to have that. So I think that if I were to answer that question, I'm thankful for the childhood that I had, but I'm also really blessed, and I'm honored to be raising my children in this day and age where they can use social media. I mean, I feel that social media is like the greatest gift. It has the potential to be the greatest gift for change and to affect change and to share our views and to connect with others who share similar views. And it has such potential when used properly. And that's one lesson that I really hope to teach my children, in the coming years, is how to engage with others in a responsible manner and to educate others online, and to how to break those glass ceilings.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. What a great way of wrapping up this episode. And I want to thank you so much, Fariha, for taking the time to speak with me and to my listeners, and for giving us some background in how you were raised and what got you to where you are today. And you definitely are an inspiration for all of those kids who are coming up who want to see themselves out there. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. And I look forward to hearing from your listeners.
Thanks, Fariha. Though we live in a largely secular society, there are many people who have committed to their faith, regardless of external factors or expectations. Perhaps more surprisingly, in this secular society, there are those who have revisited and reclaimed the faith of their childhood or family's affiliation and have become even more devoted to their religion of choice. The perspective of a non-religious upbringing in the case of my guest this week was so interesting because her largely secular childhood informed her decision to embrace her faith even more than she might have if she had been raised to practice it regularly. Because of her parents' choice to keep the faith in the background, we're fortunate enough to have Fariha as a strong advocate and spokesperson for not only those women and men in the Muslim faith, but for people of color in her city and beyond. For this, we are all very fortunate. Thanks for your time, Fariha, and for sharing your story with us. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and rate and review us on iTunes because it helps other people who are interested in similar topics find us as well. Also, you can find me on social media on Twitter at PTAN Podcast and at SamKJ27. And you can join our lively Facebook group at Parenting Then and Now on Facebook. See you soon.